Hello, this is Dr. Esmacher. In today's session, we're going to talk about the 1970s and specifically how rapid changes in the economy, the equal rights movement, and developments in foreign policy and the fallout of Watergate and Nixon's resignation all contribute to a growing rise of political conservatism leading up to the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. So, buckle up and let's dig in. So, Nixon's time in office started to see the American economy change. And in fact, Nixon got out at a pretty good time, considering that the economy was finally starting to slow after decades and decades of prosperity. In many cases, the United States Cold War strategy to help shore up capitalism in other countries to make them less susceptible to communism had a negative effect on US economic growth because, particularly, encouraging nations like West Germany and Europe, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, and Asia to develop strong manufacturing economies now meant that those manufacturing economies were in direct competition with American manufacturers as well. And so this started to cut into profit margins for American manufacturing companies. The fact that the dollar was also very strong overseas made it difficult because that made American goods more expensive when you did the conversion into local currencies. And Nixon had tried to mitigate that by decoupling the dollar from the gold standard in 1971, but it still wasn't enough. The other thing that's going on is the economic shift that we started to see in the 1950s with the decline of manufacturing and the rise of service-based economy is starting to take hold. For the first time in 1971, the United States is actually importing more products than it was exporting. So American manufacturing is going into a rapid period of decline. Manufacturing workers dropped from 38% of the workforce in 1960 to only 28% in 1980, with industrial cities like Chicago and Detroit losing 50% of their manufacturing jobs between 1950 and 1980. On top of this, the United States starts to experience an energy crisis. Rapid U.S. growth had made the U.S. dependent upon imports for oil. Think of all of the expansion of the automobile, right? Increasing number of people commuting after relocating to the suburbs. So about 1/3 of U.S. oil was imported by the time we get to 1973. And there were a lot of tensions going on in the Middle East in the late 60s and early 70s. When war breaks out between Israel and Egypt and Syria, this restricts the oil supply, and OPEC, or the oil producing nations that form this kind of joint coalition to set oil supply and prices globally, punished American support of Israel in the conflict by raising the price of oil 4 times and cutting off future exports. So Americans woke up to find that gas had quadrupled in price almost overnight. So imagine waking up to find the gas has gone from, say, $2.50 a gallon to $10 a gallon, right? That's going to negatively impact you, again, especially in an American society where we are heavily reliant on the car and on commuting for our livelihoods. This sparked huge lines at gas stations with caps put on people on how much gasoline they could buy. Congress tried to lower highway speed limits to increase fuel consumption levels by making it so that cars were higher miles per gallon. They urged Americans to conserve energy whenever possible. But that was always going to be a short-term response. In the long term, the United States needed to develop other alternatives and other strategies to deal with energy. In particular, the United States started looking to see whether there were other fuel sources that were available domestically that they could use, for example, coal and natural gas. The United States discovered oil in Alaska in 1968, and this oil was increasingly accessible to the lower 48 states after a pipeline is constructed in 1977. And as a response to this, more Americans started to buy fuel-efficient cars. Now, the downside to this was it was not American manufacturers that were producing these fuel-efficient cars, but rather foreign markets, particularly Japanese manufactured cars tended to be better at fuel efficiency, and so Americans started to buy foreign cars in much larger numbers. By 1980, 25% of the American car market was imports. So Americans who are trying to deal with these higher fuel prices are coping with this by trading in their gas-guzzling American-made cars for foreign-produced cars that have better miles per gallon, brands like Honda and Toyota. Now, the American economy and the energy crisis happening at the same time causes a phenomenon that economists nicknamed stagflation. If you're wondering what the hell that word is, it's a made-up word. So stagflation combines the word stagnant and inflation. So stagflation is when you have stagnant economic growth, so the economy is in a stall pattern or is actively declining, at the same time that you have increasingly high levels of inflation. Okay? So what this means is you as a person, right, working for your living, if you were fortunate to still have a job, where many people were being laid off because of the economic decline, your purchasing power was far less than it had been before because of inflation. And then you didn't really have a whole lot of options to go out and look for a better paying job because of the tanking economy. So the misery index, which is a measurement that economists use to gauge how bad the economy is, which looks at things like unemployment rates and inflation rates, doubles between 1970 and 1980. That doesn't mean you personally are twice as miserable in 1980 as you were in 1970, but it does mean that unemployment has gone up and inflation has gone up, meaning that the value of your money has declined. So as manufacturing declines, people start moving, trying to find new jobs. In the 1970s, 96% of the population growth is going to be in cities in the South and West, partly due to these places being where some of the remaining manufacturing plants and companies were increasingly relocating to take advantage of lower wages and less unionization. But we're also going to see a decline in jobs in public services. Many cities who are strapped for cash start laying off workforce or weakening government employee unions. And on the whole, Americans are really struggling. Real wages don't increase between 1973 and 1993. Remember, when we say real wages, we mean what you can actually get with your money. And many Americans actually end up earning less in 1980 than they had in 1970. So in the midst of all of this, poor Gerald Ford becomes president with the resignation of Richard Nixon. Now, it's important to note that Gerald Ford had not been vice president for very long before Nixon's resignation. Gerald Ford had only become vice president after serving as the House Minority Leader because Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned after he was convicted of a felony while in office. So with the resignation of Agnew, Gerald Ford was picked as the new vice president by Nixon and confirmed by the House and the Senate, as is the procedure for a vacancy in the executive branch, is dictated by the 25th Amendment to the Constitution. So Ford had not been vice president for very long. Nixon resigns, and all of a sudden Ford is now promoted to the presidency. And Ford almost immediately pardoned Nixon, which basically made it impossible for Nixon to be prosecuted for Watergate, which many people had hoped to do after he left office. One of the reasons that Ford cited for his pardoning of Nixon was he wanted the United States to move past this scandal. He was afraid it would kind of dominate headlines for months and months and months on end, and that's why he chose to pardon him. Now, Ford, who will also successfully run, no, not successfully run for office himself, he's just going to finish out that one term. Ford believed that the way to solve this economic crisis, which was ongoing when Nixon left office, was to cut taxes for businesses and lessen the amount of regulation for the economy. However, he had to deal with a Democratic-controlled Congress who very much disagreed with him on his approach to fixing the economy. Ford believed that Americans were struggling not because of a major shift that was taking place in the American economy, but more because people were spending too much money and not saving enough money. And so he announced his WIN campaign, or Whip Inflation Now, which encouraged Americans to avoid unnecessary spending and to try to conserve energy and save money, which is, again, difficult to do when your value of your money is declining because of high inflation. By 1975, the unemployment rate exceeded 9%, which was the highest it had been since the Great Depression up until that point. One of the things that Ford was successful in doing lay in foreign policy. The Helsinki Accords, signed in 1975, recognized the boundaries between communism and democracy in Europe, so recognized that sort of Iron Curtain line that Winston Churchill had nicknamed in the 1940s, separating Western capitalist democratic nations from Eastern and communist ones. And for the first time in the Helsinki Accords, this got communist states in Eastern Europe to increasingly give their citizens civil liberties. This will help lay the foundation for the end of the Cold War, in part because it does give more power and voice to pro-democratic groups. And once people experience a little bit more civil liberties than they had before, then the floodgates open. You can't just tease people with some liberties without making them open to a wide variety of liberties. But Gerald Ford is going to face a tough challenge when he goes up for re-election in 1976. He's associated with Nixon, so that's a lot of negative baggage. He's associated with a pretty poor economy, and he's going to run up against a fairly unconventional challenger.